Today, I'd like to tell you about our sponsor, Swan Private. Now, you know from listening to this show that our money is broken. Fortunately, we have Bitcoin, a better money that will help us build a brighter future. But if you don't have a Bitcoin strategy and a trusted partner to help you execute that strategy, then you're probably going to fall behind. Now, I've known the Swan Bitcoin team for years. The Bitcoiners at Swan are mission-driven and have deep expertise and respect in the Bitcoin space. In my opinion, this is the team you want on your side. Today, I'd like to highlight Swan's Private Client Services division, which guides high net worth individuals and businesses around the world toward building and preserving wealth with Bitcoin. So visit swanprivate.com and learn how this concierge service gives you direct access to your dedicated Bitcoin advisor by phone, messaging, and email. Swan will guide you on complex areas such as self-custody, or you can choose to hold your Bitcoin through Swan with one of the largest US regulated custodians. So make your first purchase with Swan Private and get $100 of Bitcoin. Just tell them that I sent you. You know, an opportunity like this to build and preserve legacy impacting wealth for your family and company will not likely be seen again in our lifetimes. Sign up at swanprivate.com today, mention Breed Love to your advisor, and get $100 in free Bitcoin when you make your first buy.
Don Mei, welcome to the What is Money show.
Thank you very much, Robert. It's good to be here.
By way of brief introduction, you are the director of the Mei Group, and you are involved in the businesses of both Chinese medicine and what I think you're really well known for, tea. Maybe here's a good time to plug your YouTube channel, because this is where I discovered you. Actually, someone sent me a video of you discussing, which we're going to talk about today, the difference between individualism and collectivism. But you're doing it on your channel while having a nice tea session, which I thought was cool too.
Yeah, so Mei Leaf is the tea brand of Mei Group, and we have our YouTube channel, which is Mei Leaf, MEI_Leaf. And yeah, it's a channel which primarily the purpose is tea education. So I've been involved in tea for 20 years. And when I started, I was very frustrated with the lack of information out there, or lack of credible information out there. So I thought, you know, that as I learned, I would share the knowledge. So it's not about master and student. It's about, we're all students, we're all learning. I just want to get information and pass it on to people so that it makes learning about tea easier and hopefully interesting. And yeah, as you said, we touch upon all sorts of topics, the intricacies of tea, but also people involved in tea or people who love tea tend to also like to focus on some of the philosophical aspects of tea and of society and of life. And so every now and again, I throw in some extra videos with my musings on that.
Very cool. Do you think that is because the tea ceremony itself just kind of naturally encourages you to engage in those deeper conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk for hours about tea, when you draw it down, tea gives us space. Tea gives you a space for hopefully a tech-free space, which means you're less distracted, so you've got that space to entertain thoughts, but also there's a certain magic in the tea brewing process and drinking process because of its subtlety, because you need to it sort of draws your attention. It sort of has a really mind-clearing process. It also has chemicals in it which improve lateral thinking. And so it sort of sends you off in different directions, gets you a bit tea drunk, gets you a bit tea high. And lots of the elements of tea sort of mirror things in life, sort of impermanence, the idea of ineffable truths that you can't quite put your finger on. There's something about tea which is trying to discern quality in tea is a very difficult thing and is very subjective, yet is also undeniable. You know, it's something that people get, but so it mirrors a lot of things in life, and it mirrors a lot of things about living, and this sort of search, the quest for truth and understanding and all of those good things. And so, yes, it sort of generates that kind of mindset, I think.
That's really interesting. Something about the ritual of it too maybe appeals to something really deep-seated in our evolutionary history, that we engage with one another in ritualistic form. And what you said there about it being subjective yet undeniable, I was just thinking about that recently with the beauty. You know, beauty is always in the eye of the beholder, but there are things objective about it as well, right? Like symmetry and these other qualities. So
precisely. There are qualities that you can describe, but there are just as many qualities that you can't describe. And that's sort of the beauty of tea, and I think why people really enjoy exploring tea, because it's sort of a lifetime of that kind of exploration. But the ritual certainly plays its part. In China, they say that tea requires three things. It requires leaf, water, and you. And so your involvement in it is certainly fundamental, but also the relationships that it builds. Having this kind of space with other people is a very bonding experience. Yeah,
it's really nice. Honestly, you're just having tea here and it's enjoyable for me, even though I'm not having any, just engaging in the ritual.
Next time, if you're in London.
I have always really appreciated I've always leaned towards green tea. I'm not a big specialist, so I kind of just got the basic stuff, but just an unsweetened green tea. And what you said, where it helps your lateral thinking, is tremendous. It gives your brain some type of agility that I don't have on anything else. I can't just drink coffee and get that. I've actually recently quit caffeine, so I haven't had any tea or coffee in a long time. But maybe I'll come back to some caffeine-free tea that you recommend me.
Well, yeah, but also it's worth remembering that tea also contains theanine, which is synergistic with caffeine, and so it sort of modulates the effects, and so you get a very different psychoactive effect with tea. But it is interesting how it changes the way that you think. Hence why I need some today, and interesting, the sort of demographics of the people who are our main clients tend to be people who are involved in things like programming, or, you know, that kind of enterprise that requires lateral thinking to make their decision making, to try and find lateral ways to make the processes more efficient.
Right. Yeah. So interdisciplinary type work or multiple domains, you can helps you draw connections laterally.
Exactly.
Yeah. Very cool. Yeah. Well, so as I mentioned earlier, just again for the audience, I discovered your work through this video that was recommended to me. And I think the title is Individual versus Collective, which is better for humanity? And this was a Chinese New Year presentation that you did. It's like a 30-minute video, just you having tea and talking about the differences between individualism and collectivism. And I think it's a very impressive piece of content. So we'll link it to the show notes here for people to check out. But I was, this piqued my interest because clearly this is a dichotomy we talk about a lot as well on this show. So I thought it would be a useful discussion for you and I just to sit down and work our way through some of these topics for the audience.
Right.
I think you kind of started with collectivism in your video, but I'm going to go individual, then collectivism.
Okay.
And we'll just see which way it goes here. So, as you open the video, you describe individualism as something that's, I don't know what we call this, a philosophy, I guess, really focused on the supremacy of individual freedom, the intrinsic worth of the individual. And this is something, a philosophy, I guess it's traditionally contained within schools of thought like libertarianism or anarchism, even free market capitalism in its purest sense.
In its purest sense, yeah.
Although we don't really have that anywhere, just kind of a theory, it would be based on individualism as well. So maybe we just start there. Can I just get I'll go ahead and ruin the video for people too, but we both lean individual, I guess. So how have you established that worldview for yourself that's centered on individualism above collectivism?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's in a way the idea of versus is probably a little bit misleading. So we can sort of talk about that later. But because I think that the idea is that the individual is the sort of a priori truth of collectives. The collective is defined by the individual.
Yeah.
So the individual, by definition, comes first. The individual is the supreme moral unit, in my opinion.
Yes,
And
I like that term, by the way, moral unit. I've called it the individual is the elementary particle of society, but moral unit's even better.
And you could probably move a layer beneath individuals and look at nature. So you could sort of, you could stagger it, and we can sort of talk about that later. But if we talk about the individual, well, first and foremost, the individual is the creator of all reality, in the sense of, well, we can talk about quantum theory and the idea of, the observer being a creator of reality. But even if we put that to one side, I mean, essentially we are living in a sort of gray soup of information, right? And we are receiving that information, and we are creating experience, through our senses. And so in its most basic form, all of our experience of reality comes from the individual, and comes from our interpretation of this data through our senses. Then, once you've established that, you can also say that any action or any planning of any sort is done by an individual. It's never done by a collective. You don't plan as a collective. You plan as an individual. You act as an individual. Decisions are made by individuals. The consequences of those decisions impact the individual. They never impact the collective. So if you just strip it all down, the individual has to be the supreme unit. And also, if you look at the idea of knowledge, and the learning, the gaining of knowledge, the storing of knowledge, or the narratives that we create to disseminate knowledge or wisdom through generations, that is, again, all done by the self. It's never done by a collective. And so for all of these reasons, I think that the individual is the primary unit, and is the predecessor of collectives, or it is the individual that defines the collective.
Yeah, it's really well said, and it somewhat intuitive, I think, when you put it that way, that of course the individual is the only one that actually has senses, right? We are relating to reality through our senses. A collective doesn't have senses, right? It's just this useful fiction that individuals have narrativized or written to, as you said, to help disseminate knowledge. I would also add in there just to help coordinate people, right? We use useful fictions all the time to help coordinate and communicate. Language itself is a useful fiction, right? But what's the old Taoist saying, that the moon and the finger that points at it are not the same thing, right? Words are just pointers to meaning. So we're immersed in this, I think you called it the gray soup of information. I would say a lot of that information is contained in these useful fictions, but there's this danger where we start to mistake the representation for reality itself. And that's where you leave individualism and go into something like collectivism, where, the nation, you do it for the fatherland or the motherland or for your company or whatever imagined structure we put together. And we start to ascribe it human-like qualities, right? That it can think and act and plan. That's where the disconnect occurs. So, and to your great point, obviously, in physical reality, only individuals are bounded and distinct. They're using means to pursue ends. They're making decisions. They're engaging with reality. So what is that danger? Is this something like a tribal instinct, perhaps, that we start to confuse our representations of reality with reality itself? Or, because it seems like we've fallen down this trap many times throughout human history.
Yeah, I think that the formation of collectives in a way is a natural process. I think that we need to step back a little bit and also say that the individual, what I don't want to say is that the individual is some sort of isolated, distinct entity.
Right.
Right. Of course, the individual is relational.
Yes.
Right. We're related to nature, we're related to our environment. Everything about our environment affects us as we affect it. And so there's always going to be relations happening, right? And you could also sort of talk about ideas of extended mind theory, where your phone is part of yourself, or, you know, or you could sort of talk about, well, you can always talk about the interconnected nature of things. But from a pragmatic point of view, I think that you can say that the individual is concrete. You know, you can look at Buddhist ideas of the individual, you know, and its sort of ephemeral nature. But I think from a pragmatic point of view, in this discussion, we can talk about the individual as connected. But relations are very, very important. And so naturally, we form relations. And one of the things that, you know, I often hear is that the Eastern way of living is a more collective way of living, you know, versus the Western way. But I think it's sort of confused. Obviously, there's lots of different things we could talk about. There's a big difference between Confucianism and communism, for example, right? So Confucianism talks about relationships. It's the supremacy of relationships over the individual. But that, I think, is different from the supremacy of collectives over individual. Like the idea that your relationship with your family or the groups around you are very important is, I think, I would agree with that. That's a natural way to go. Now, eventually, you are going to need to cooperate, right? And that cooperation means you're going to get groups of people. And with that cooperation, you're going to need to create some sort of shared purpose, right? Some sort of shared
values.
Shared values, exactly. So you look at the value of the collective in terms of its function, or you look at the values of the collective in terms of its sort of moral compass, if you like, right? And so these are all natural tendencies. So this is why I think it's misleading to say individual versus collective, even though that's what I did, because it's a nice YouTube title. The idea is that the individual is the primary unit. It will naturally form collectives. The problem is the corruption that happens in the formation of collectives if they are not governed properly. Governed is probably not the right word, but baked into the formation of the collective needs to be some sort of method of anti-corruption, right? And you know, we see this in terms of democracy and, you know, ideals of how we can try to instill anti-corruption. And obviously, you know, Bitcoin is the very unique situation where that it literally is baked in,
right?
And it can't be taken away, which is why it's so magical and such a beautiful thing. Yeah, so I think there's a natural tendency to form collectives, but I think that if you follow that natural tendency, there should be a natural tendency for the splintering of those collectives.
Right.
In other words, you should create cooperative groups for a sort of aim, but those aims will always be shifting.
Right.
So you've got to keep your radar up, right? Because the purpose of a collective is very hard to define.
Yes.
And will often get steered by individuals that can lead it to places where you've got essentially a group that's working on behalf of individuals rather than genuine collective good. And so essentially what I think needs to happen is you need to have the right kind of startup for these collectives. But that is a very difficult thing to do, right? Because inevitably the collectives sort of take a life of their own, and herds start to develop and tribes start to form, and you start to get all of the classical fallout from that herd mentality, exclusionism, dogma, and lots of other things that we can talk about in terms of, you know, when we sort of critique, you know, the problems with collectives. But I do think it's a natural tendency that we do form collectives to achieve aims. The problem is that we should not be protecting those collectives. We should be protecting the individual. And I think that that's where we've got our wires crossed a little bit.
Yeah. And you mean specifically when you say protecting collectives, I assume that means the political apparatus protecting collectives. Is that what you mean?
It could be, but it doesn't have to be. It could even be on a smaller level than that. The point is that when you have collectives, there is a tendency for people to want to ring fence power, right? So the idea being that the people who exert the most influence on the collective get used to exerting that influence, and they don't want it to end.
Yes.
Right. And then that influence inevitably becomes a bit selfish, and they start to say, well, I'm going to make decisions for the greater good, but the greater good just happens to also help me, right?
Yeah, of course.
Or help my buddies over there.
Yeah.
And so you have a problem there, which and the problem is that the people who have that control obviously don't want to lose it.
Yeah.
And so they therefore create structures that either political structures, but it could be other structures as well.
Yeah.
Financial structures. It could be, you know, moral structures potentially. They create structures that protect the collective, but essentially protect their own sort of control and domination. And that is where I think the key problem, or the key flaw in collectives is, and it needs to be flagged, and it needs to be a red flag, and it needs to be something that is constantly looked at, because if we allow that to happen, then you run into all sorts of problems.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So let me echo some of this back to you and maybe a slightly different framing to get your thoughts. So cooperation is kind of the magic of being human in a way, right? We figured out how to cooperate at a scale no other animal can, and that's why we dominate the world, basically. This is the Yuval Harari thesis in his book Sapiens, that human beings can cooperate flexibly and in large numbers in a way that no other species can. So, said another way, cooperation is more fruitful for everyone involved. We're all better off cooperating. We actually pragmatically create more wealth. We get more done in the world. We solve more problems, however you want to say this, working in concert than we do working in isolation. So cooperation is like the holy grail of human existence. It's what increases standards of living and wealth and capital and all that. But to cooperate effectively requires rules, right? We all need to play by a set of rules so that we know what to expect from one another, right? That's kind of like the channels that guide our action is whatever rules we're in. But in these collectives that the individuals comprise, inevitably, as you said in your video, there comes to be a small group of people that really are the decision makers, because humans are hierarchical, right? Just like a lot of animals, we have a few dominant or persuasive people that kind of get to the top of the hierarchy and tell the rest of the hierarchy what to do to some extent. Is it accurate for me to define corruption then as those individuals in power in a hierarchy applying the rules differently, either bending the rules for themselves, breaking the rules, circumventing the rules that all the other people in the collective hierarchy are forced to play by, or expected to play by, maybe is a less strong word? Is that in my effort to define corruption, because that is the core problem here with the collectives, I'm trying to really get a hold of corruption itself. Is that the right way to think about it? That you have, let's call them public rules, which really just whoever's in the hierarchy, that are then bent or twisted for private gain, as in the individuals making or applying the rules are misapplying them? Sorry, that's a long-winded question. I hope it made sense.
No, it's not at all. I think it's a very important question. So first of all, just touching back on what you said before, cooperation is fundamental, but also competition. And I don't want to come across as sort of an airy fairy. Oh, we should all competition is a very important part of human development as well.
Yes.
Right. So cooperation and competition, I sort of, in a way, they go hand in hand.
Yes,
in my view.
Yeah.
But there's a difference between that and control and domination. In answer to, or to sort of, to explore the point that you were making, I don't think it's just about circumventing public law or rules, because those laws and rules are always going to be subject to change, right? Bitcoin being a very different example, but like in terms of collectives, inevitably you're going to react to things. You're going to go, oh, well, the market has changed or the environment has changed, and we need to adapt, right? And so you can't be rigid in saying, well, no, sorry, we set that up 5 years ago, you can't change it. So there's always going to be an adaptation and a creation of rules or a change in direction. So I think that the idea of corruption goes a little bit more abstract than that. For me, the idea of corruption is the stagnation or prevention of flourishing. So in Chinese theory and in Chinese medicine, we have this concept called qi, which you may have heard of. And there's lots of different definitions of qi, right? People talk about it as the life force and all of this stuff. And it's a very difficult thing to get your head around and to even discuss. But from all of I've been involved in Chinese medicine for 30 years, not as a practitioner, but just listening to people, basically. And what I note is that qi can mean many things, but essentially it means it is what happens in nature naturally, is the movement towards flourishing. It's the yin and yang of entropy, in other words, right? So you've got this idea of, as we move forward, laws of thermodynamics mean that we head towards entropy, but also there's something built into into nature, which is a movement towards flourishing, to developing complexity, but enhancing and encouraging life and flourishing, right? And so, and this is the problem. It's very hard to define that within a collective, but essentially what happens is that a collective's purpose should be in service to that flourishing, in my opinion. Right. And so the moment that it stops being in service to that flourishing, it should splinter. Right. It should either split up into different groups, which might make more competition and best wins, etc., which is, competition, which is good. Or it might dissolve altogether and return us back to individuals for that particular subject matter, whatever it may be. But the moment that individuals start to move the direction in order to achieve their own personal gain, rather than the flourishing of the relationships and the social, because I think it's also that we sort of distinguish social from collectivism. I know that socialism is a form of collectivism, but we should try to sort of separate them. Social is this idea of relationships and cooperation.
So social being like the actual 150 or less people you engage with, or is collectivism being beyond that?
Again, the idea of Confucianism, the idea of the smaller relationships that you may have. So in my view, corruption is a very difficult thing to pinpoint, because it can't just be about saying, oh, you've changed the law or you changed the rule, that's corrupt.
Right.
It's got to be decided upon, or it's got to be defined by how much it's preventing this flourishing of an ideal, of a purpose, of a function, whatever the collective was set up to do. And I do think that it's natural for all collectives to reach that tipping point where, because, we are fallible beings, right? And so it's going to happen, or it's likely to happen, but it needs to be something that is, as I said, flagged, and it's very hard to flag it when it is a little bit abstract like that,
Right.
because it can be twisted in many different ways, as we've seen, right? Where, you know, it seems like the collective is on the surface presenting the idea that they're doing something good, but in fact, you know, there's all manner of evil going on.
Yeah, to an extreme, right? I'm reminded here of the Marxist credo, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. Beautiful utopian, you know, wrapper, if you will, for that collective, but it perpetrated its exact opposite. Okay, so
just to briefly sort of add to that, I think there are some flags that will warn you of it, right? So it may be abstract in terms of trying to define it, but I think there are some flags. For example, dogma, right? Censorship, emotive propaganda, demonization. These are all very clear and very easy to see if you've got your eyes even half open.
Maybe
right?
us versus them, the in-group, out-group thing.
Precisely. The lack of tolerance, right? Extremism of any sort of form. These are very clear markers that a collective has gone wrong. So even though it may be hard to actually pinpoint what it was that caused the fracture, there are many signs that are very clear and have been proven throughout history that you can spot. And I think that as soon as they are spotted, they should be called out.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. So I want to, you make a great point. Rules have to be fluid, otherwise you're dogmatic, right? It's, hey, here are the rules forever, they can never change. That's not good, because reality changes all the time and we have to adapt. And if you become dogmatic, then you interrupt that process of adaptation. But I want to be careful here, because agreed, rules need to be fluid, but the rules in force at any snapshot point in time, right? Whatever rules are agreed to by the collective, they need to, for the collective to operate optimally, all of the members, the individuals in the collective, need to adhere to those rules. And if they're not adhering to those rules, and to say there's a couple of people at the top that are ignoring the rules or bending the, or abdicating from the rules or abusing them or twisting them, whatever they're doing to not follow the rules, they're pursuing their own personal gain then at the expense of everyone else that is following the rules. So what's a simple example here? Maybe just like pollution. If we agreed that throwing trash, and I know this is a whole complicated area that we get into, but let's just say we all agree that dumping sewage in the water supply is a bad idea. But then there's a couple of guys at the top of that hierarchy that decide to start selling licenses for dumping sewage in the water, that they pocket all the cash, right? They're bending the rules, hurting everyone else in the process, but they're bending the rules to enrich themselves. So is that then, I'm still on this point about corruption being, I agree with you, rules need to be fluid. So I'm hoping I can separate these two things, that rules do need to be fluid and adaptable, but at any given point when they're in force, everyone needs to adhere to them. Otherwise, if they're not, then that may be the way to pin down corruption.
No, certainly. I mean, I think that the key point here is that any changes in rules need to be agreed in public. You know, you can't have some rules and then in the background you know, subverting those rules in some way. So I am not saying that, you know, rules have to be fluid and therefore everyone can just sort of change them up as they go along.
Right.
It needs to be something that is discussed and agreed upon, and that is something, and if the collective does not agree on it, or it raises concerns or flags, then that should be another way of deciding whether or not the collective needs to be changed. Right.
And we call this in Bitcoin a fork, right? Where the collective is going two different directions. You should just let the collective split.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's the perfect example of how I think the sort of natural way of collectives should be. And I think that the problem is that we have systems and power structures and compliant media and all sorts of different techniques and apparatus that mean that natural process of forking doesn't necessarily happen, and in fact hardly ever does.
Right. Yeah, no, it's, yeah, well, there's a great point there that I'll try to get to later, but I don't want to skip something else you said that was really good. Qi as the, I hope I'm repeating this correctly, the flourishing which happens in nature, right? Like, what's the old Taoist saying, that nature never rushes, yet nothing is left undone. You know, we have all this natural abundance around us, and it's just coming. I guess that's what Qi is, this natural energy that's creating all this.
Well, the idea, I mean, I guess, okay, so this is my own personal take on Qi. So I don't want to like say that this is the classical, because if you speak to 10 different doctors, Chinese doctors, or 10 different people studying classics in Chinese medicine, they'll give you 10 different answers, right? Yeah. So the way that I look at it is this: why do we make the assumption that evolution should tend towards flourishing and not destruction? You know, why? Why is it in that direction? You know, we sort of have this ingrained in us, oh, that, you know, the garden will grow, you know, that beings, organisms will become more complex and will become more sentient, and we will, you know, become more complex, cooperative, you know, beings like us. I mean, we, even the individual is a corporation of bacteria and, you know, all the rest of it. This sort of this idea that we head towards the flourishing of life and the continuation of life, right? From the very basic, you know, single cell, even further back, you know, to the sort of atomic level, the idea, you know, why is there, you know, gravity? Why is there this movement towards this? And on its most basic level, that's my sort of interpretation from listening to all these, you know, people for decades of what Qi is. Instead of this idea of some sort of discrete energy which somehow floats around in your body with acupuncture, you can sort of enable it. It's the idea of there is the yin and yang of entropy. There is this opposite which defines entropy as well, right? Which is complexity and flourishing of life. And that is fundamental to natural law and fundamental to everything that should inform, I think, the decision-making, the decisions that we make as individuals, the decisions that we make as one higher up relations or social, all the way up to sort of, you know, the highest sort of intellectual sort of, you know, I don't know, ledger, the intellectual ledger of mankind. Right. Yeah. So like, you know, I think that's my sort of version of Qi in a way. And I think that it can be applied pragmatically from a health perspective as it's done in Chinese medicine, but it can be applied in other ways as well. Yeah. So it's, I like how you're tying this back to entropy, because that's sort of what defines life in a way. This is a whole rabbit hole we could go into for a long time, but I'll just leave it with this one quote. I think it's from G.K. Chesterton. He said that a dead thing can go with the stream, only a living thing can swim against it. So there's only one force that goes against entropy in the universe, and that's life, basically. Yeah. But this idea that we, you know, again, just the undisturbed natural world converts sunlight and water into plants and vegetation. I mean, I guess that interaction is somehow driven by Qi, however you define it. And I find it interesting that humans do kind of the same thing. Like, if you just leave humans alone, this is a great point that Safety said in his recent interview on Lex Fridman, capitalism is what happens when you leave people alone. Yeah. So it's not a state, it's not an implementation. There's no force, there's no ideology that was planted into the soil, then people started to follow it. It's literally self-organization, human self-organization. And exchange. Yeah. All driven by exchange. Absolutely. So the question, I want to tie this back to your earlier point on flourishing, like
when the collective stops serving flourishing, rather, that's when it should split. How do we measure that, though? Because aren't we then back in this subjective complexity of, you know, your flourishing is on what I call flourishing? Is there a way to quantify it?
Now you're starting to move into the area of how do you quantify these ideas of like truth and, you know, all these, it starts to become very difficult. And that's why I think that you look for the symptoms, you know, but the symptoms are very easy to see. It's like a disease, right? If the symptoms develop, you can see that there's a problem. Now, you might not know exactly where the problem is,
right?
But there's a problem, right? Now, then you have a choice. Can you find the root cause of that problem? Because there's no point in symptom bashing, right? But there's no point in just trying to, you know, put a balm over, you know, the symptom itself, put a Band-Aid over it. You need to find the root cause of it. And inevitably it's going to be, you know, some sort of corruption of an individual. Most likely. I mean, I don't want to say that exclusively, but most likely.
Yeah.
So I think that the key here is that keeping your eyes open for the symptoms is very important. And then trying to find the root cause if you can. But if you can't, you also need to know when to just, you know, let the fork happen, right? And I think that one of the problems also is when you untether the value proposition of the collective, when it becomes untethered from something that's distinct, discernible, measurable, then it's also more likely to just sort of find its way towards a corrupt state, I think. So yeah, I would sort of look for those signs.
Right, because that, when it's untethered, when the purpose of the collective is untethered from an objective metric of some kind, you introduce all this opportunity for rhetoric, right? The greater good. Like,
exactly.
No matter what I do, it's for the greater good. And, you know, yeah, okay. Point well taken there. Okay, this wasn't complicated enough. I'm going to try to make it more complicated now. You mentioned the corruption.
I'll have some more tea.
You mentioned the corruption of the individual, I think, is a catalyst to the forking of these collectives, maybe, right? Like a individual in power becomes corrupt, so that, I guess, propagates through the collective and then ultimately necessitates a split or maybe even the demise of the collective. Well, I don't know that we ever got our hands fully around corruption, but what do you mean by corruption of an individual? And where I'm going with this, like all cards on the table, is my view is that there's a deep relationship between, and you said this earlier, right? We are all the products of our environment. There's another quote that says, human nature takes the shape of its container. So I always view incentives as being like the landscape. You're kind of pouring human nature onto this landscape of incentives. And I can't tell you exactly what people are going to do, but if there's something that makes people rich, I think a lot of people are going to do that thing. Not everyone, but a majority. So you can, you know, as Munger said, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. So I'd just like to try to untangle that a bit. When you say corruption of the individual, how does that relate to corruption of the collectives as well? Is there feedback loop? Are there feedback loops between them, or how do you view that?
I view the corruption of the individual as, well, I view that the success of a collective is reliant upon a large proportion of the individuals that make up that collective to be to have their eyes open to the corruption of the collective, obviously, but also to and I don't want to come across as sort of, you know, trying to define a superior being versus an, you know, but a sort of enlightened being versus an unenlightened being. But I personally think that there's a lot that we need to reformulate around the ideas of self-value. And what I mean by that, because I get into trouble when I talk about this sometimes, is so value is a way of it's the drive that creates action, right?
Right. Yeah.
But it can be defined by the utility or worth of something, right? Or its ability to achieve a function.
Right.
We can separate values from value in terms of morals and ethics, and we can discuss that if you want. But the idea is that I think that values drives society, it drives action. You talk about incentives, you know, I think that they're in a way sort of a similar viewpoint. But the concept of self-value, I think, is a very dangerous thing. And what I mean by that is that if we distill that back to human beings and we say, well, if in order to find the value of something, we essentially need to have two things, right? We need to have we need to understand its primary function, and we need to have some way of measuring it, right? And this obviously goes into money and all sorts of areas. But when you're talking about human beings, then you need to define the primary purpose of a human being. And I think that really, from my point of view, and probably from a lot of sort of Eastern tradition and Buddhist points of view, is being, right? That's our primary function. And therefore, we have achieved our primary function as soon as we're born, right? And so the concept of self-value, I think, is a bit of a sort of a fallacy, because your self-value is sort of a being value, right? And that's irreducible. It doesn't matter. It doesn't even matter what you do. And this is where people get a bit, oh, but I could kill someone. And, you know, so we, you know, talk about that separately. But the idea is that, from my point of view, self-value leads to all kinds of problems in the world. And I think it leads to the corruption of collectives, because self-value is, first of all, it's not tied to any function. So it could be anything. Well, what defines your self-value? It's going to be changing all the time, right? How rich I am, how pretty I am, how humorous I am.
This is egotism. Is this related to egotism?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the egotism and self-value are very, very much linked. But I think self-value is what leads to egotism. Gotcha. Because essentially what it is the idea being that in order for me to value myself, I need to I need to float myself on the stock exchange of, you know, beings, right? Yeah. And therefore, how am I judging that? I mean, you know, is it how rich I am? Is it, you know, how clever I am, or whatever it may be? Yeah. And so you're forced into this game of an untethered sense of value. So it's not tethered to anything. There's no way of measuring it, really, other than through comparison and competition, right? But this is different for me because it's a competition with no winner, right? It's always going to be changing. You're never going to be satisfied. You're always going to be on the treadmill. And this sort of harks back to sort of Buddhist ideas of relinquishing that reliance, right? That being in a state of non-reliance, which is essentially the same thing as what I'm talking about. Like the act of being is enough, right? But when you are untethered in terms of your function, in terms of discerning self-value, and untethered from any way of measuring it, you're just bobbing around in a sea of just unknowns, right? And the only thing that you can do is to try to assign yourself a tribe. Because you're like, well, how do I judge my self-value? Well, do you like me? Do you like me? You know, oh, this group, I feel I identify with this group. And then in order for you to prop up your own self-value, you inevitably sort of occupy echo boxes because you want to hear stuff that's good about yourself, right? And so that makes you susceptible to the herds of collectives. Right. So it comes from, in my view, it comes from, so we can talk about collectors being, some sort of, they can become corrupt, but it's the responsibility of the individual to resolve that problem, right? It's and so if the individual is the supreme unit of moral concern, it's also the premise upon which the corruption takes place, right? So therefore, you need to work on that, because self-value leads to need leads to tribalism, need leads to all negativity. I mean, if you look at it, if you really sort of boil it down, most negative emotions in life are related around need, right?
Yes.
And there's a difference between need and want here, because what I'm not suggesting is that we all just sit back and go, oh, we're beings and everything's fine, and that's going to somehow create a society of sort of lazy, inert, I don't know, it's going to lead to apathy, right? Because I actually don't think that that's the case. I think that if you take away the need, you free yourself to achieve, to express, to celebrate, to be positive. I mean, if you look at it, collectivism, the staunch defenders of collectivism as the supreme unit are essentially very pessimistic, right? It's the idea that individuals shouldn't do it on the. We need the collective, because individuals left to their own devices
can't be trusted.
Can't be trusted. Will create a fractured, isolated society and all the rest of it. So we're talking about the corruption of the individual. I think that self-value is a key part of that. We need to work on that, and I think that that's one thing that is missed a lot by a lot of society, because we are constantly told to value ourselves. I think that even though the intentions are right, I think that that's a very wrong way of that's the very wrong teaching. You should say that you are already at full value. You are being done, irreducible.
Right.
Now you have a short window in this world. Go have fun, right?
Right.
Play the game, celebrate, go seek out and try to achieve your wants by all means, whatever they may be. Becoming rich, becoming, powerful, whatever that might be. But the moment it's tethered, or the moment that it's somehow intrinsically part of your self-worth, that's a problem. Because then you can justify doing all sorts of naughty, nasty, evil things, right? And you can justify the corruption of a collective. You can justify ring fencing power. In many ways, it's sort of synonymous with pride. Yes. It's this idea that it's this all-encompassing rationalization that, oh, you can do it. So for example, if you're a CEO of a company and your self-worth is essentially defined in your mind by the profits of the company, then what kind of, you could do all sorts of poisonous things to society, because you can justify it, or you can justify, anyway, you can justify all sorts.
You justify anything, because that is, you've made that, Peterson has he has a lot of definitions for God, but one of them is the highest value in a hierarchy of values. So if you're that CEO and you've put profit in the top spot of your hierarchy of values, again, value being that which determines your action, he's effectively made profits his God, and he'll subject anything to that, right? Subordinate anything to that.
But if you connect it to self-value, then it's like part of your foundational structure. So if you fail, it breaks you, right? And this is why we've got to be careful about an individualistic society that doesn't have this, that also teaches this concept of self-value, because it's the reason why, quite rightly, you can say that individualistic societies also have high levels of depression and anxiety, and people, because what you create is this plethora of choice, right? Which can be debilitating. And you create fear. because if your self-worth is dependent upon the consequences of your pursuits, that is what leads people to stay in bed and not get out and go and do things and be creative and express themselves. So I think it's the opposite to how a lot of people would sort of maybe view it at first glance. I think that by relinquishing self-value, you actually increase ambition. You actually increase creativity, you actually increase innovation, and you actually reduce what would be broadly under the consensus of evil acts.
Right. Yes. No, this is all really good. I like how we're talking about there's the internally conceptualized hierarchy of values that we each have, but then through our interactions and, construction of collectives and engagement of these multiple collectives, we create a macro hierarchy of values that is civilization itself. And I think, at least in Western civilization, we've decided to put life, liberty, and property at the top of that thing, pursuit of happiness in the United States, but really just freedom ultimately.
Yeah.
Now I'd like to tell you about a great new Bitcoin show on the scene that you've got to check out. Brought to you by Swan Studios and Bitcoin Magazine, this show is Hard Money with Natalie Brunell. Natalie is an Emmy-nominated journalist bringing unparalleled experience to the Bitcoin media scene. And personally, Natalie is one of my favorite voices in the Bitcoin space. Each week on Hard Money, you'll get the top headlines of the week with analysis you won't find anywhere else. Hard-hitting interviews with amazing guests like myself and other top minds in the Bitcoin space. And the show will take you directly into the lives being changed by Bitcoin all over the world. Check out Hard Money at swan.com/hardmoney. Today, I want to tell you about our sponsor, Crowd Health. So, how does health insurance work? You send an egregious amount of money to an insurance company. They hold it in a pool of depreciating fiat currency. Then, when you have a large health event, you have to pay them even more via your deductible. And then you hope they will cover your bill. And in fact, 1 in 6 bills are denied by healthcare.gov plans. It's time to take control of your own healthcare bills. I'd like to introduce you to Crowd Health. It's a decentralization of healthcare using Bitcoin as an alternative to health insurance. Instead of sending fiat currency to a big corporation, you send that money to an account controlled by you, a portion of which is converted into Bitcoin. Then, if you have a big health event, you have a community of Bitcoiners that will use the money in their accounts to help you out. To get more details, go to joincrowdhealth.com/breedlove, where you can find the promo code for $99 a month for 6 months.
So this seems like maybe a good time, because you did go into some of the potential downsides of individualism. I think it'd be useful for us to talk about that. So I'll read a couple of things that are quoted out of your video. I hope they're quoted correctly. I typed it as fast as I could. The individualism of free market economies can result in self-centeredness. This is a potential downside of individualism. Another one would be, without a strong collective like the state, who will take care of individuals in society when they need help and protection? And then you use this to lead up to the question you said that we have to ask: what is the primary deciding factor that determines if an individualistic society flourishes with human enlightenment or becomes fractured by human greed and selfishness? And I think that's such a, excellent posing of the question itself. Sort of has echoes of that, like, how do we quantify human flourishing, which is not quite possible. It doesn't sound like. There's always some subjectivity there. And your answer was, and there's a lot more to it here, but essentially the qualities of the individuals, right? It's the individuals that are choosing to decide and what qualities to develop and whatnot. But I wanted to throw another element into this, is that because my answer to that question, being much more economic standpoint, would just be the integrity of private property. So, as you've just said, leave people free to pursue whatever they want, get as rich as you want, do whatever, enjoy yourself. You got a short ride. But the limiting principle, I think, that is most pragmatic and moral in that free for all that we've basically laid out. There has to be some limiting principle. Otherwise, you know, the guy will be like, oh, I like to eat people, so I just ate a bunch of people. And, you know, that doesn't work for society. So the line or the limiting principle in my mind has to be the integrity of private property. It's like, do whatever you want, get as rich as you want, pursue the satisfaction of all your wants up to the point of violating anyone else's person or property. That seems to me the way to best construct a collective that is, let's say, free from corruption, both internally and externally. I would just love to hear your thoughts about that.
Well, I fundamentally agree with your point regarding property and the sort of foundational sin of theft, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Whether or not it's thieving of private property, thieving of somebody's life, thieving of somebody's, all crimes in some way are theft.
Yeah. Right? All coercion, all, yeah.
Right. So I agree with that. I think that, look, as humans, we have a certain set of needs, right? And I think that it's very important that we don't overplay those needs. I think that's one of the problems. You know, we need food, we need shelter. I think we need relations. I think we need to have the freedom to have relations, which is, you know, was a problem in the last couple of years, as we know.
Yeah.
I think that we do also need to be protected from theft. Now, theft of life, theft of private property.
Yeah.
And I do think that there is a role for a state in that, even though I'm always cautious of, propping up the idea of state. I do think that there is I think that if we made a state responsible only for the protection of these primary needs and nothing more, right? I think that would be an interesting experiment to run, right? Because I think that, you know, in many ways, the state was created to protect private property, right? You know,
yes.
It's sort of that's what made sense about creating the state, right?
You say the primary needs. What are you referring to specifically?
Having enough food, having some shelter, being able to be freely interacting with other people, and protection from theft. You know.
Yeah, I really strongly agree on theft. I get a little tripped up on the first two, though. If we're guaranteeing people food and shelter, that can necessitate theft. If there's not enough to go around, then governments start to engage in wealth redistribution.
Look, I understand that it's a rocky road, and I'm 100% with you on that. I do. There is still part of me that still feels that having a very basic safety net for people, I think is, and I do say very basic safety net. Like, I'm not suggesting that, you know, I think that we've gone, it has become corrupted. And I'm a great believer in allowing the market to, you know,
sort it out. Yeah.
So, you know, I'm happy to be proven wrong. I can't, and you might be able to enlighten me on this, but I can't think of any free market economy that managed to succeed to protect, you know, everybody's intrinsic needs without some level of collective. But maybe I'm wrong in that.
No, well, you're correct. I don't think there's any social or socioeconomic system that's ever eradicated poverty, right? It's just nothing has ever done that. I would also add in there, when we've never seen true free market economies, right? We've only seen kind of glimmers because property has always been breakable, basically. And every time you break property, you leave free market and you go into something else. This is a very sticky question though, because people say this to me all the time, like, well, without the state, what about, the homeless shelters or the welfare or this, whatever social safety net or program is in place, who's going to provide that? And I don't have a great answer. I mean, it seems to me like there are, well, a couple of things. One, if you take the state out of the equation, you're taking theft, you're removing a lot of theft from the system, which means more aggregate wealth creation. So even the poor among us will be way better off just by virtue of this machine creating more wealth. Even if you're at the bottom of the hierarchy, you're still going to have, you're going to benefit. Basically, there's more food supply, more innovation, medical, et cetera. But further beyond that, I know people are still going to struggle, right? People are still going to be homeless or broke or make mistakes or be addicted to drugs, whatever the thing is. How do we take care of them without the state? And this is where my answer is not great. It's like, there has to be some communal fabric, that I don't know, volunteer organizations, philanthropy.
Right. So now we're going back to the idea of relationships and social versus state. And I think that, the idea is, a system. Let's take state, because state is a sort of could be sort of a dirty word here, but there has to be a sort of a collective agreement on, we don't let people just die in the gutter, right?
Yeah. Then everyone will agree to that. Everyone's like, yeah, I'm against poverty. We got 100% yes votes. Everyone's against poverty, but who pays for it? That's the problem.
So there's a difference between theft and agreeing to contribute to a system, and so, you can look at taxation, and as a businessman, believe me, I don't have many pretty words to talk about in terms of taxation, but like at its core level, the idea of communities grouping together and say, right, let's save some funds for a system of protection that is very rigorously checked for people who are abusing it, right? I think that no matter how individual you are, no matter how much of let the market decide person you are, I think that in my view that makes sense, that there is some way of grouping together, cooperating to create a system to protect people's very, very basic needs. But going again one step back to my idea of self-value, I think that the main corrupting element that drives everything above it is this idea that I talked about before, because it's the self-value that creates this idea of, or justification for, states that are thieving, and that's I think if we could take away, not take away, you're never going to take it away, but if you could have enough proportion of society who are have this approach of being value is the only thing, and self-value is an illusion, then I think you can achieve more cooperation and in collectives, and I think collectives can operate more effectively with less corruption. That's not to say they won't become, and the fork will need to happen, but it's at least going to be flagged up, I think.
Is another way of saying that difference between self-value and being value, is this like intrinsic, extrinsic motivation, where just by virtue of being alive, you are intrinsically valuable in a way that, as you said, it can't really be compromised, right? Because if all action is an expression of value, and being alive is what engages, like if you're alive, you're engaging in action. That's what kind of the definition of it is. Then you sort of have this meta value to you in a way, right? You're creating value just by virtue of being alive. Whereas in this self-value, you're seeking extrinsic value from others. Like, do you like me? As you said, do you like me?
Yeah. Self-value, when I'm talking about that, I guess what I'm talking about, I'm not talking about creating value. I'm not talking about using value to dictate action. right? Because, but these are, as you said, extrinsic value. You know, it's going after your wants. It's seeing things that are valuable and trying to achieve it. The problem is when it's affecting when it's tied to your self-worth.
Right.
And I think that that's really the problem.
And that's so hard personally. Like, I mean, you're a businessman. I'm sure you've had some rough roads a time or two. And I know when I've experienced failure in life, self-worth gets clobbered.
Yeah. And that's precisely the work that needs to be done. And in a way, the value of failure, right?
Yeah.
Because, you know, we talk about working on the self, or, you know, a lot of people say, well, how do you work on the self? And then people talk about mindfulness and no mind and detachment and all of this stuff. But you can't achieve that unless you really focus in on this, in my view, central problem, which is we all sort of somehow say, oh yeah, self-value, that's a great thing. You know, have self-value, have a sense of self-worth, right? Yeah. And I think that in a way, that's the little hidden gremlin, right? That sort of around which all sort of corruption happens, and you don't see it. You see it as something that's virtuous in a way, or it's being presented in a virtuous way. Make yourself feel good about yourself. Yeah. Listen, go out and enjoy yourself. Take pleasure, you know, as long as, you know, again, you're not thieving or you're following your moral compass. But understand that at its core, this is a game, right? And at its core, it doesn't really matter, right? You know what I mean? Life is going to go on, and stuff's you're going to die. And this is what tea teaches in many ways. It's sort of, it's this impermanence, this, once you really bring that into your heart, then you can start to see the illusion of self-value. And you can tie it to egotism. I think people now sort of go, oh yeah, ego, bad, you know?
Yeah.
But not enough people sort of take one step further back and go, no, what creates ego is this sense of self-value and self-worth. Like, and in a way, that's what religion previously gave to us. You know, we're all equal in the eyes of God.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's something that when we stripped religion out of sort of, you know, I don't know, like, you know, it's obviously not gone, but, you know, once the sort of paradigm moved towards objectivism, materialism, whatever it might be, we took away that fundamental thing that I think is fundamental to a good society, which is leave your pride at the door, forget self-worth. We're all equal. This is just a game. Let's just have fun. We can cooperate, we can compete, we can engage in the game. But we don't need, we are taking away, we're detaching ourselves from that reliance, because that need and reliance leads to anxiety, depression,
the fear,
fear, captivity, all of those, you know, you could throw them all together in one, you know, bucket. All come from attachment, and that attachment all comes from this idea of self-worth.
Yeah, I'm reminded of that song, All We Are Is Dust in the Wind. You know, it's like, it really is ephemeral and fast, and you just got to enjoy it. But we do have this enterprise where we have to cooperate to improve living standards for everyone. So you need rules. We need a collective moral compass, I guess. And that's what we've been kind of fighting about. Well, you know, what is the correct, proper moral compass? And, you know, figures like Christ or like Buddha, they kind of are supposed to be the archetypes of that compass, right? Like, live like they lived.
Well, I mean, I would sort of take a Taoist approach to that and say, look at the morals of nature, right? You know, take that. You've got different levels, right? You've got the sort of natural world, and you've got the individual, and then the individual leads to relationships. And eventually those relationships become collectives, but that's sort of a sidearm. And then you move to sort of intellect, right? So in a way, every action in a way is a moral action in its most discrete form, right? And every action in nature is a moral action. You've got this yin yang that we talked about of the chi and the flourishing versus entropy, and there's constant dynamic interplay between the two. When it comes to morals, I think that it may be very old-fashioned, but like I still like the idea of do unto others as you would want to do unto yourself, right? I think that is a pretty unbreakable, way to guide your ethics. And I think that we have become confused by this idea, proposed by some people, that you should do unto others as they would want you to do unto them, right? Which is a very different thing, and requires you to separate yourself from yourself, right? Which is an impossible thing to do and leads to all sorts of problems. And that's why we're scrambling around to try and figure out where our foundations of ethics are, right? But if we go back to the basics and go, let's work on the idea, whether or not you're religious and you believe in an absolute goodness and divine law or not, it's sort of irrelevant. The idea being that do unto others as you would want to do as you would want to have done unto you. That ethical way of looking at the world, that is a pretty good moral compass, right? And I think that you could pretty much, live your life with that and be under the consensus of a good person, and I think that in many ways, talking about that idea of self-value, that can the need for self-worth can overtake that ethical compass very easily, I think, because it's so, as I said, it's so intrinsic to your emotional state, right? And so, and the most successful people in the world are people that are less concerned about outcome and just more concerned about doing. Right. And they take their failures on the chin and they get up and move on, right? But essentially, they sort of have a more light way of playing the game of life, right? And the people that are so concerned about their self-worth, you can see it. It's visible in people's body language. They're so nervous about what people think about them, or about whether or not they're going to succeed or fail, etc. Right. That leads them to such a fragile sort of emotional and mental state that the overcoming of that, even temporarily, somehow supersedes ethics. And that's where I think you do have a problem with morals.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things you said there reminded me of, I think a lot of states today seek to keep people in that mode. If you can keep people scared and flight or fight mode, then they're not going to engage higher order reasoning to deal with reality. They're just going to react, right? And if you're a person or persons in a position of power and you just want to move people like chess pieces, then that's the mode you want them in. I'm reminded too that there's the old Rothbard quote that to be moral and act must be free, because you can't coerce a moral action. That doesn't even make sense. So, I mean, for me, it just seems like freedom is at the basis of human morality. But you make a great question with the one about like the morality of nature, and it's all Darwinian. Everything we're talking about here is Darwinian. But the difference with humans is that we have this, again, higher order ability to reason. So we can step outside of ourselves, self-reflect, decide what the best course of action is, and then implement that course into our social fabric, which it seems like we've been trying to do for a long time. We've had some pretty good success. Like we have, whatever, we're going into the digital age now. I mean, that's something. That's a lot more than any other animal's done.
No, this is the thing. Like I said before, I think that in many ways, people who hang on to the sort of crutch of collectivism as the sort of supreme unit are very pessimistic about human nature. I'm very optimistic about humans. I think that, I think that it is, it is remarkable what we've achieved through exchange, through communication, through the ability to store information and make it more efficient and, communicate that through generations. I think that the problem is that this idea of self-worth is manipulated, and it's not just by the state, but it's also by marketeers, right? The idea that you need to buy something in order to feel good about yourself.
Oh, right.
Right? You're worth it.
Right. Yeah.
Kind of thing, right?
This is like the extrinsic validation thing again.
Right. And so that's where we have to be very, very careful, because I think that, as I've banged on and on about, is the bedrock of corruption, and the bedrock of this stagnation of flourishing.
And presumably this is what religion or wisdom traditions provided us, was a bulwark against that. It's like, you don't need to buy the new thing to be valuable or worthwhile. You are, right? Now you can add to that if that satisfies your wants, great, but it's not going to augment or modify your self-worth. Precisely.
And that's where we've got to, we've got to be so careful, about throwing away all of these valuable lessons that religion teaches us.
Yeah, agreed with that. Just as a quick aside, you've said this a few times now. You talk about the inorganic level going into biological individuals, into the social level, and then into the intellectual level. I really think you would enjoy the book Leela. I don't know if you've heard of this book. It's written by Robert Pirsig.
Oh,
he wrote Zen in the Motorcycle Maintenance. 15 years later, he wrote Leela.
Okay.
I have an entire series about this on my channel called the My Kill series, but I think you'd really enjoy the book. It's better than Zen, and Zen's pretty damn good. I don't know if you read it, but anyways,
I'll check it out for sure.
Yeah,
for sure.
So we should probably beat up on collectivism a little bit. So collectivism puts the supremacy of the group above the individual.
Yeah.
Collective goals then are held to be superordinate to individual goals. Basically, this is an inversion of individualism, but with a little caveat here that, as we said earlier, groups don't really have goals. Collectives don't really have plans or intentions or any of these things that we individuals do. But when we start to think in terms of collectives, we start to ascribe those qualities. This is anthropomorphizing, I think, the collectives. And that leads to some really dangerous stuff, because now people in position of power can, again, engage in rhetoric, right? There's I think I heard this from Graham Hancock, quoting some old poet. It was called The Old Lie, that it's a glory to die for your country. It's those types of framings are possible once you start to mistake the collective for the individual.
Yeah. Well, it's the idea that benevolence is somehow equal to sacrifice. To sort of becoming a sacrificial lamb is benevolent.
And Ayn Rand beats up on that a lot too.
Yeah. And also there's a lot of problems with corrupt collectives. Obviously, you've got the ontological problem of this sort of fallacy of concreteness, right? It's like it's not a real thing. I mean, look, you can real is a difficult one to, if it's a concept, it could be considered to be it's like a brand, right? It's like my brand, Mei Leaf, right? It's like, it's real in the sense that it has an interaction with individuals, right? But it's not real in terms of its concreteness. It's got no physical location or dimension. So you've got that problem. You've got the problem, as you said, of the purpose or the function of the collective. Very rarely, maybe when it starts, is this idea of the collective good, but that's a very difficult thing to define. It's continuously shifting, And I think you're on very shaky ground if you're going to say, well, majority wins.
Yes.
You know, it's like, well, 51% says X, so screw the 49%, right? I don't think I think that's such a weird sort of black and white way of looking at how you make decisions. It certainly isn't nuanced.
You had this great quote in your video. Sorry to interrupt. You said, is it morally justifiable to punish 49% of the population for the benefit of 51%?
Yeah.
Pretty obvious that, I mean, I think most people would agree that that's not justifiable.
And yet that sort of is sort of one of the sort of
current model
benchmarks of the model of democracy, right?
Yeah.
Or the election of who's going to lead us.
Yeah.
So yeah, you've got lots of problems there. I mean, obviously, as we talked about, the problem of the individual taking control, or a small group of individuals taking control, and then starting to hide the way that they're doing that, creating new laws, ring fencing their power, creating faceless organizations is another beautiful technique, where you get this, as Hannah Arendt said, you know, the tyranny with no tyrant, right? This sort of faceless organization, the computer says no sort of model, where it's just like, and that's something that we are having to deal with more and more and more. I mean, it just seems to be just amplified to such an extreme now, where it's just like, but well, I can't do that. Oh, because, I don't know. You know, you try and call a helpline and they go, I don't know, it just says no. And you're like, come on, people, like, take back control and things. Also, by definition, collectives all have different functions or different purposes. And you're going to have lots of collectives coexisting that will all have different purposes. And therefore, there's going to be this competition between these collectives, right? And so it sort of creates a combative environment in a way, right? And the individuals within those collectives are in a way forced to decide which tribe they are going to go with, right? Because you might have lots of different values. Well, you should have lots of different opinions as a human being, right? You should be taking them from all sorts of tribes, you know, across all sorts of sort of traditional political spectrum ideas, which I think are a bit sort of woolly and unnecessary these days. But you should have lots of opinions, and yet this sort of collective structure sort of in a way forces you to say, well, we're competing either directly or indirectly for your attention, right? So therefore, which one are you going to pick? Right. And so it sort of forces you into a more isolationist echo box of, of a tribal sort of way of thinking, which then engenders or promotes dogma, promotes herd mentality in order to protect the individuals in power. And then propped up with, as we've said before, communication, be that propaganda or emotive communication, usually in the form of fear. And then you create this sort of demonization, all of these flags that we talked about before. But there's a lot that can go wrong with the collective. And the key thing here is that when a collective goes wrong, the impact on individuals is far greater than an individual that becomes corrupted in some way, whatever that may mean. And so the dangers are much bigger. And so as the collectives grow and become global collectives, then you've got major potential for huge, problems in the world if it's not handled correctly.
Yeah. So if anything, we need to design systems where these collectives can, as we said earlier, fork or fragment and die, right? They need to be able to die. The individuals and capital that are held in that collective can then go elsewhere, be put to other uses, or engage in other activities. In the case of individuals, anything that we do to inhibit that process, you're kind of interrupting the process of evolution itself, right?
Exactly.
And in the world of modern macroeconomics, we would call these zombie companies. These are the companies that produce losses, so they're not solving any problem in the world profitably, and they're subsidized by theft, right? The government steals from taxpayers and keeps this company alive. So that is really dangerous, because now those collectives, not only are they producing, again, not satisfying any wants profitably, but they're also growing. And then when they inevitably do collapse, it's that much more catastrophic versus the way it would have been had they been allowed to die naturally earlier on when they're smaller.
It is exactly as you said. It's anti-evolutionary. It's anti-flourishing.
Yes.
And that's the huge danger, because, you know, in a sort of individual or small community level, nature can absorb that, you know, or human society, the evolution of human society can absorb that, because it's in a way natural, right? But once it's become this sort of artifice, these global artifices of, you know, then that are being propped up and just being through theft, being propped up, that are running at a loss, or are preventing the flourishing through, you know, holding on to their power. I mean, this is why, you know, there's, I think this sort of that funny feeling of, you know, that we're on the brink of something, you know, which could be an egotistical thing, because, you know, we all like to think that we live in a lifetime of the huge paradigm shifts, but it certainly feels very much like there needs to be a rebalancing here. The evolution needs to take over, or the natural order or natural laws need to start to be expressed more.
Yeah, you've got this great quote in here from Mises. He said that society does not exist apart from the thoughts and actions of people. It does not have quote unquote interest and does not aim at anything. The same is valid for all other collectives. And I'm just struck, you know, even really, really smart people. I'm thinking of a lot of these macro thinkers, they're macroeconomic analysts. They're always talking in terms of these collectives, what China is going to do, what Russia is going to do, what this group is going to do, but it's just not a proper level of analysis. I mean, I know it's a useful fiction. We can't think at the individual level all the time. There's too many individuals, too many relations. But if you, again, start to substitute that representation for reality in your mental model, you get really confused. And it just seems like it opens up the door to a lot of evil, because even you were describing earlier that these different collectives are competing, which they are, but it's really the individuals controlling those collectives that are competing with other individuals controlling collectives for whatever it is they're competing over, right? More wealth or territory or resources, whatever it may be. Man, just so confusing. It's like,
but I think that your last point is the crucial one. Whatever they are competing over for. Because here's the thing, it's like, if they are genuinely competing over the function that was set out by the collective at its inception, then that's one thing. It could still lead to a splintering or whatever it might be, you know, but that's natural competition. I'm not necessarily against that. It's when their purpose is to prop up their own individual power, self-worth, whatever it might be,
right?
That's when we've got the problem, right? So it's
when they're leveraging the collective to prop up their own individual aims.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly where it should, by definition, the collective has now stopped. Right? Right. That's where it should be like, okay, now that's it, right? Because that's happened, or there needs to be a huge shift in the structure, or there needs to be change. There needs to be some change. And so I think that it's fine for there to be competition. And in many ways, I don't think it's a problem on a, you know, on a fundamental basis for the collective to become larger and even maybe become global, even though there's a sort of, there's concerns around the level of control that they may have. But the fundamental problem is when it's overtaken by individual needs that trump the ethics of the collective.
Right. That's the corruption.
That's the corruption.
Yeah.
That's where the alarm bells should be ringing at full volume, especially if they're large collectives.
Yeah.
And we see this all the time. I mean, you just have to scratch the surface of any sort of, collective, especially sort of global, especially huge industry collective with lots of lobbying, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I've been involved in the politics of medicine for near on 30 years. I have sat through meetings that would make your, toes curl in terms of the lack of logic and sense. I have sat with decision makers in government around healthcare.
Yeah.
They have looked me straight in the eye and said, we can't talk about health and food. They are not related.
My God.
Because the definition of food is that it doesn't have a pharmacological effect and it can't cause harm. And I'm literally in the room looking for the hidden camera.
Right.
Because I'm just going, how are you in charge of healthcare? I mean, how is this possible? And so,
wow.
and so it's actually not that easy. It's not that hard to spot this madness that's going on. It's just that you need to have your eyes open to it, and there needs to be a system that goes on in full alarm mode. And this is where we really are reliant on our media, and they have failed us, right? For the most part, right? Because these are the necessary checks and balances that need to happen, right? When there's such a level of nonsense, that's going on at the highest levels of decision making, it needs to be called out. It needs to be exposed.
Yeah, that's how far we have drifted from the Hippocratic oath, right? Let food be thy medicine. Crazy. So you make this other great point too in the video that the collectives are by nature exclusionary. Obviously, you're either in or you're out, you're a member or you're not. But they also have this weird effect where as they grow, the decision-making power is naturally concentrated into proportionally fewer individuals. So whatever, if you're one CEO and you're leading a business of 10,000 people versus a business of 1 million people, obviously that power is more concentrated. And then, as we said, the corruption sort of occurs when that individual or individuals start to put their own whatever benefit above the purpose of the collective. It kind of stops being a collective at that point. Is this then, I often talk about Bitcoin, which we just mentioned here. I think that it's the first thing we've made where you can't really do that. You can't twist the rules of Bitcoin in any way to advantage yourself. And I think it's to my knowledge, the only thing we've ever created like that. So is there a relationship then between the I guess I'll say unbreakable rules here, but I still agree with you on the fluidity of rules, and Bitcoin can update things, but there's a social cohesion on, no more than 21 million, all these other consensus rules. Is there some relation between let's say the fixity of those rules and incorruptibility itself, both internally and externally?
Well, we talked about before the idea of value being tethered, right? And the untethering of value of the collective is, means that it's subject to individual corruption, right? Because you can go, well, now the value function of this collective is to keep me in power, or to buy me a new home, or whatever it might be, right? Or to prop up my self-worth. The amazing thing, the wonderful thing about Bitcoin is it's tethered, like 21 million, that's it. It's completely measurable, and it's uncorruptible. As far as I know, I'm not a Bitcoin expert, but it seems to be the first thing that I can think of that has that you can have trust in.
Yeah.
which is fundamental, right, to economy, right?
Yeah.
Confidence and trust, because of the fact that you can't mess with it.
Yeah.
You know, the rules have been set. And so, yeah, it is a remarkable and quite beautiful thing.
Yeah, there's just no opportunity because there's no individual in charge, right? Or individuals
Right.
in charge. So there's no opportunity for said individuals, hypothetical individuals that would be in charge, to put their own interests above the collective network's interests.
Yeah, it's like collective 2.0, right?
Yeah, right.
You know, it's like, you know, it's collective, but there's
the
no
ideal.
way
Is it the ideal collective because it's premised on the sovereignty of the individual?
well, I think that you've got to my concern about saying that is that you've taken, I mean, again, I don't know enough about Bitcoin to know how fluid it is in terms of being able to adapt, right? But from my understanding of it, is that, you know, my concern would be that it serves an excellent function from a sort of value point of view in terms of a means of exchange, right? But is it adaptable, or is that concept, the Bitcoin concept, portable to other collectives? I'm not sure, but I would say that it does seem to be an excellent experiment to try.
Yeah.
You know, because I think that it's quite clear that would be something that we should be exploring at full pelt,
Yes.
because you know, the idea of a decentralized collective that's incorruptible, I mean, it seems like the Holy Grail, but I wouldn't you know, I wouldn't presume to say that it would suit every situation.
So interesting. You know, yeah. Many of the problems we've highlighted here, I think it bridges them somehow, or it finds a balance. Clearly nothing's perfect, but it is interesting. I like that term you use. What'd you say? Decentralized, incorruptible, decentralized collective.
Yeah.
I might tweet that.
There you go.
All right. I want to talk a bit about, because you kind of complete the video going into this work on the self, and I think you have a game too, the States of Self game. I think that's what it's called.
We did. It's taken offline every Christmas, every like end of year. I try to come up with some game for the T community to follow. Yeah.
Well, I really liked the rant you went on at the end, and I'll throw out a few points you said here. I'm not going to quote necessarily, but I'll just kind of paraphrase. You're saying that life essentially is a journey of the self, that we're all born innocent, but then our innocence inevitably meets experience, right? We hit the real world, so to speak, and the experiences are rarely under our control, but our responses to them are. And I love this because I had the word responsibility unpacked for me once, and it is response dash ability, your ability to respond. This is actually one of the most essential things in life, is that none of it's under your control. I mean, we could argue about that. Maybe there's a little bit that is, but
yeah,
for the most part,
yeah,
I'll go ahead and use the collective useful fiction of none of it is under your control. But you do have this, and I got this from you know, Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning. He calls it the final human freedom, that there's always that gap between your external circumstances and your chosen response. You get to choose how to respond. And the way here's like the rough description I've tried to use to help bring this point home. If a meteor strikes the earth, you and I are on a nice Sunday stroll and we see a meteor, a big one, like out of the movie Deep Impact or whatever, fall in front of our eyes, and we see a giant explosion. The quicker we can move from despair or, oh, you know, woe is me, a meteor just hit the earth, the quicker I can move from that state of what I would call is irresponsible. You've chosen how to respond, but it's not a productive response. The quicker I can choose to respond effectively with competence to take action to start resolving the problem, the better off I am and the better off the entire world is. And the same for you and the same for everyone else. So another way of saying that is like the more response ability we take, the better off the world, full stop. So, and another thing I've heard put is that you can only really control your effort and your attitude. So I would just like to hear your thinking on this, the profundity of responsibility and then the importance of controlling our effort and our attitude and how that, I guess, helps us and helps the world in the process.
I think it's the fundamental interface, isn't it? You know, there's life happens. You're going to have things, all sorts of experiences, as you said, most of which are not under your control. How you frame it is really all that matters, you know. And the States of Self game was an exploration into sort of the dual tracks that you could take. And you've seen, you know, there's like memes of, do you want to sit on the look out the train on the, you know, the sunny side, or you're going to stare at the, you know, a brick wall, you know? It's sort of like, it comes down to, are you going to be in harmony with the flourishing of life? Are you going to be a positive influence to yourself or to others? Or are you going to descend? And so the States of Self, the idea was, you know, innocence is the starting point, and then that leads to discovery, but it could also lead to insecurity. Insecurity would lead to conformity. Conformity would lead to ego and need and all of those things that we've talked about before. Also, I think it's interesting because I'm trying to explore this relationship with responsibility, and I like that split, with health. Because health is an ability. It's not a state. I mean, we think about health as like a state free of disease, right? But that's a very static way of looking at health, and it's very, actually, you know, it's not accurate, because nobody is, right, free of disease, right? Nobody's. It's a very black and white sort of dualistic way of looking at things. That's not the case. It's very static. Health is a dynamic thing, right? Yeah. And in the same way that stuff's going to happen to you, right? And health, essentially, my definition of health is, what's your ability to respond to those external influences? It might be it gets cold outside, right? Or it might be something more extreme. You might get hit by a bus, right? But what is your ability to respond to that? And the response is not just about, does it extend your life? Because I think that that's also short-sighted. It's also about, how happy does it make you? Because ultimately happiness is the pursuit of, is our pursuit, right? Right, yeah. And so if you sort of look at sort of a dividing line of like length of life on the y-axis and happiness on the x-axis, and you get like a cross where you get negative and positive. You want, like, stuff's going to happen to you. You want to try to make it so that you hit that top right quadrant, right? Where the impact on your life expectancy doesn't decrease, or, you know, increases, hopefully, like if you're doing great things, but essentially stays neutral is also good. And also your movement towards a happier state is also something that you're trying to achieve. And the way to do that is by moving the axes. It's not by like you know, you've got to train yourself to make that space bigger. The framing, you know what I mean? The framing. Yeah. So you've got to move the axis. That's the key. And that's what the key to healthcare should be. It's what the key to mental health should be. It's what the key to, I think, a lot of philosophical and religious teachings, or any teaching, should be, is how do you move the axes? Because you're not going to necessarily be able to change, or you're hardly going to be able to change the events, right? Yeah. To some extent you will, but, you know, it's about moving the axes. And I think that that's the key, not just in terms of, you know, sort of your way of dealing with events in terms of your mental or emotional state and how that drives you forward, but also in terms of your health. And I think that health, in many ways, you could throw that together, because there's no point in leading a healthy life if you're miserable, right?
Right.
You can live to 200, but like, not experience any happiness. I don't think that that's the right way. That's not a definition of health for me.
Yeah.
Right. So it's interesting, because this is an area that I'm sort of trying to evaluate and touch upon now with work that I'm doing, is how do we define a healthcare system that looks at responsibility?
Yes.
In order to achieve a healthier society. And I think that your point is exactly the right point. It's about how we can improve our ability to respond, and move the axis accordingly.
That's great. I mean, that fits perfectly with your description of, health is not static, black or white, healthy, not healthy. It's an ongoing dynamical process. We're being attacked all the time, and it's how effective is our body at responding to those threats and dealing with them. And yeah, it's all, that's it. That's maybe a key point too, is just, it's all dynamic. We're talking in little static snippets and static collectives and all these things to try and map it, but the map is never the territory, right?
It's always movement. And that's, I would say, is probably one of the sort of key, I don't want to, this is probably very broad, but one of the key sort of differences in the way of looking at the world, and both have pragmatic purpose, right? So it's fine to look at things in a static way. It's fine to look at things in a very detailed, isolated way, because that, if it serves a purpose, it serves a purpose. But understanding this overarching dynamic quality is one of the things that I think tea teaches. It's also one of the things that is sort of baked into sort of Eastern ideas to some extent, even though, there's a lot of Western philosophy that adopts this as well. But it is central to also Chinese medicine. This idea of this dynamically shifting state of the body, and what you're trying to do as a doctor, or as it extends outside of medicine, is allow the natural chi of flourishing to find that balance, allow that dynamic shift to happen. The moment you try to fix it, you're in trouble. And this goes back to exactly the same arguments or discussions that we're talking about, collective versus individual, self-worth, etc. Beneath the individual, you talked about inorganic, I think, but is that the natural law? It's that natural, this evolution, this idea of flourishing, this idea of isness. I mean, we talked about before, like, why do we assume that evolution is always going to be moving in the direction of complexity and flourishing? I would also pose the question, why do we assume the default state is nothing? You have like you have this sort of argument, why is there something rather than nothing? Well, why is it that way round? Why is the question framed in that way? Right. Like the something, the isness is, to my mind, the default state, right? This yin yang between entropy and flourishing, between, static and dynamic, between all of these things, that is the default state. We must allow that to happen. Right. And the more we obstruct that, and as humans, we have become so good at, one of the problems with the development of humanity is we have become very, very skilled. And as soon as we obstruct those default states and that process, then we run into trouble, be that healthcare or the health of society.
Yeah, again, such a sticky situation, because some human interventions are innovations that really improve life and whatever, but many I would say most human interventions are not, they do not achieve their intended result. Let's just say that. So we're in this situation where we need to experiment with different things, but we also have to have a lot of humility and accept when something is not achieving its intended result and let it die.
And also fundamentally understand that the end goal of whatever innovations we have cannot be at odds with
flourishing. Yes.
This is not an anti-technology discussion,
Right.
Right. I mean, this is not about anti-innovation.
Oh.
This is about simply understanding that that innovation needs to be in harmony with chi.
Yes.
For want of a better word.
Yes.
You know, and that's really sort of the fundamental determinant of whether or not that intervention is constructive.
Yeah, no, it's excellently said. I'll finish with this. It's getting towards the end of your video here, but you make this point that, so coming from this perspective of, I guess we could say, dynamic discovery, right? That this opens you up to embrace novelty. Whereas the alternative would be from the perspective of insecurity, we're going to be scared of novelty, right? And there is a balance here. Again, it's, you know, in nature, you can't just run naked into the hornet's nest, right? You got to have some caution. The ego is necessary, right, to protect you from death, but it can also inhibit you. So, and in that state of insecurity, you're more likely, as you said, to seek the safety of conformity. And that's where I think people that are in the fight or flight mode, they're more vulnerable to ideological possession, right? They're more susceptible to it. But if you can stay in the dynamic mode of discovery, then you can get to presence, right? Which is just the realization, maybe like that final human freedom, that you're always here, you're being, again, the world's happening, you're having experience, and you come from a dynamic place of an ability to respond, I guess. That's what liberates us from worldly worries, as you say. And then in this state of presence, we achieve freedom. I agree with you on all of that. What I'd like to propose is that, so this idea of saying, of liberating us from worldly worries, that's what gives us this freedom to be, I don't know, more in a more dynamically secure position, something like that. And this is where property too is super important, because if I can go into the world and work, create value and own that value, and I know I can own that value independent of the actions or opinions of others, then I'm also elevating myself from worldly worries. So, and you probably know where I'm going with this, but just the integrity of private property, again, being so closely connected to our ability to achieve presence and liberation and freedom. We always say private property rights, but the flip side of every right is responsibility too. Like if you have a right to 3 hot meals a day, well, then it's someone's responsibility to cook those up. So I just wanted to explore the connection between this idea of achieving presence, liberating us from worldly worries, and getting us to freedom, but also the implementation maybe of that principle being in private property itself. They seem very closely related to me. I just wanted to hear what you think about it.
It's an interesting point that I hadn't really thought about, but because, the sort of classical approach of presence is present, being, it's again, the being value, right? The idea of just be, and have that sacred present moment where all of the negativities that are generally, well, always associated with either the past or the future melt away and have that presence. And that leads to, as we said, leads to a freedom, right? I think that it certainly is the case, to my mind at least, that what would hinder that state, right? What would prevent you from that state? So then you talk about what worldly worry would you have that would inhibit your ability to be in that state of presence? And I would certainly say that the idea of not being able to protect private property would be one of those, would be a main issue that would hinder you from that state.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily mean that you need lots of stuff in order for you to be present. You can have very little stuff, but if your stuff is under threat, or if your private property, and that could, again, we could talk about property being something, not just things, right? It could be, your life or whatever it might be.
Well, your body too, as you were saying earlier
exactly.
about health, you own your body. So,
exactly. Precisely, which is a very important point these days. But so I agree with you that presence is very heavily hindered by the threat of private property being, or if the sanctity of private property isn't protected, then that would be a hindrance to presence for sure.
Yes, yeah. And then I'm sorry, this is just coming to me too. When you describe the guy getting hit by the bus, a lot of your ability to respond to that situation is going to be in relation to your property, right? How much wealth do you have to now go to the hospital and get put back together and all of this? So,
so health,
it gives you that dynamism, right? If you can preserve property across time, I have more options no matter what happens.
No, absolutely. I mean, we can't be naive to the importance of that, and the sense of freedom that it can bring. But I do think we have to be wary of inextricably linking the idea of richness or wealth with presence and freedom.
For sure. It's not the richest guy in the world's the most present or free.
Right. And we know that the richest guys in the world are also tend to be not happiest guys in the world as well.
No, that's an excellent point. Again, as you said, don't, in the hierarchy of value, we have to be careful not to put that, although it's pragmatically necessary in many cases to achieve present, maybe not necessary, just useful, right? You could still get hit by the bus and just be meditating through the whole thing and not worried about it maybe, but for most of us, we need recourse to property to deal with situations.
Absolutely.
But to never put that above just being itself, right? You are whole in and of yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Don, I've really enjoyed this conversation.
So did I.
This is really good. I think we could do this again, probably do it a lot too. I will definitely be checking out more of your videos. If there's any you can point me to, or actually if you want to mention any of them now for the audience, let them know where they can find out more about you, and then maybe point them to a couple of videos.
Yeah, I mean, you can just head to the Mei Leaf channel. It's 90% me tasting teas and talking about teas and exploring teas. So if that piques your fancy, then please do, engage and, see if you want to get involved in the tea community. But I last year I did a video about truth. The previous year I did a video about the value of value, talking about self-value. I've also done some videos about, exploring consciousness and happiness. So yeah, you can go search Mei Leaf, MEI Leaf, and then type in like truth or consciousness or value, and stuff should pop up.
Awesome. Well, Don, thank you so much. Really appreciate you coming on.
It's an absolute pleasure, Robert, and thank you for having me.